Good evening, and welcome to the Dallas Historical Society. My name is David Lee, and I am the Director of Education and Programming. Established in 1922, the Dallas Historical Society is the oldest organization in Dallas County committed to preserving the region's history and presenting it to the public in innovative and informative ways. We are honored to host David Bush and Jim Parsons as part of our 2023 Evening With Lecture Series. David Bush, Preservation Houston's Executive Director, developed his interest in historic architecture in his hometown of New Orleans. He holds a master's degree in historic preservation from Middle Tennessee State University. He's worked professionally in preservation since 1990, spending most of his career with Galveston Historical Foundation and Preservation Houston. Jim Parsons, a native of Baytown, puts a passion for the state's history and architecture to work coordinating programs and educational outreach as Programs Director for Preservation Houston. In addition to his preservation work, Jim has written about and photographed cities across the United States as a freelance author, editor, and photographer. David and Jim are the authors of 4 books on Art Deco architecture in Texas, including Fair Park Deco, Art and Architecture of the Texas Centennial Exposition, published by TCU Press. So please join me tonight in welcoming David and Jim. Thank you.
We're going to try not to.
Don't trip me.
Well, that would be a good start to the program if we both end up tripping each other.
We wander, so we have to have microphones. Mic cords. Hi, I'm David.
I'm Jim.
Jim. We're very grateful to DHS for inviting us back. This is the first live program we've done since probably 2019. We've done a couple online, but we have not had a live audience for almost 4 years.
Yeah, so if we don't know how to act,
yeah,
that explains it. And that will probably happen. We're happy to be back at DHS. It has been a while since we spoke here, and it's always a pleasure to be in the Hall of State in this beautiful place to talk about Fair Park and talk about the Texas Centennial. And as you see on the screen, just to set expectations, we're going to be talking about Fair Park tonight, but we're not going to be doing the whole history of Fair Park. We're going to be zooming in on Fair Park as it was recreated for the 1936 Centennial Exposition.
And, you know, back in 1936, if anyone thought of Texas, outside of Texas, the image they probably had was cattle, cowboys, and cotton at that point. It was a very different state. Only 6 million people in the entire state, less than the current population of the Metroplex. Most people lived in towns of less than 2,500 or on farms, and of the farmers, more than 50% were either sharecroppers or tenant farmers, so they didn't own their land. It was a very poor state. Cotton was the cash crop. The bottom had fallen out of the cotton market in the 1920s. The one bright spot in the economy was oil. About 120 miles east of here in Kilgore, all around Kilgore, in 1930, they discovered the Great East Texas oil field, the largest oil field in the contiguous United States. Oil had its own problems. It would flood the market, the bottom would fall out of pricing. So it was a difficult time, not just in Texas, but obviously across the country.
Yeah, and in the midst of the Depression, civic leaders, business people, city governments decided one potential way out of the darkness was to hold big parties, expositions. So the 1930s became the golden era of World's Fairs, thanks to some of these larger expositions like Chicago in 1933, San Francisco and New York in 1939. These are ones you've probably heard of. There were also smaller regional fairs held around the country in cities like San Diego, Rochester, Cleveland, and in Dallas. The idea behind all of these was the same. People would be put to work building the fairgrounds and then staffing the fairgrounds. They would draw tourist dollars for people attending the expositions, but then the idea was long-term, people might come to the city, be impressed enough to settle, and then they would contribute to the local economy going forward.
Now, in the mid-1930s, Texas' three largest cities, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, were all about the same size, and each one of them put bids in for what was then called the Central Exposition. San Antonio thought it had the inside track because it had the Alamo. Houston's bid was focused on the Battle of San Antonio. Dallas wasn't founded before the Texas Revolution, but Dallas put up money. Dallas was the only city that offered to pay for everything, even if the federal government didn't kick in money, and even if the state government didn't kick in money.
Which they did.
Yeah, they probably expected them to.
Right, but they said they didn't have to.
Yeah.
Dallas also had something that Houston and San Antonio did not have, which was Fair Park, a city-owned fairgrounds that had been the home of the State Fair of Texas for the past 50 years. Fair Park had substantial buildings that could be reused and remodeled for the exposition, and no other city in Texas had a facility like this, so that also put Dallas in the lead.
And this is the man who was responsible for transforming Fair Park, George Dahl, 41-year-old architect. He had visited many expositions around the United States and Europe, so he had an idea of how fairgrounds worked and what didn't work. And he was responsible in the end for all of the designs on Fair Park, in Fair Park.
Yeah, and when we say he was responsible for all of it, he was not supremely overworked. He didn't do this all on his own. He had a team of architects and engineers and artists who he brought in to help. Many of these people had also worked on fairs around the country, so they knew how to do this work at the scale and at the speed required. The thing that set the Centennial Exposition apart was all of the design decisions had to be approved by George Dahl and his staff. So even if an outside architect came in to design a building, Dahl had the final say on how that design went. One newspaper said Dahl was responsible in the end for overseeing everything from the biggest exhibit hall to the smallest peanut stand.
And this is what they designed. It was called the Magic City, 183 acres, more than 50 buildings, either remodeled from existing buildings or designed new, built from scratch, all new utilities, all new landscaping, designed and built in 9 months.
So when we talk about the timeline, it was a pretty severe timeline. When the Centennial Exposition opened in June of 1936, it was something like Texas had never seen. This was on a scale that we just weren't used to back then. There was a lot of excitement, as you can imagine. We have some newsreel footage from the archives of Dallas Historical Society that captures some of that excitement. We're going to show you several clips tonight. The first one has to do with the opening of the fair. And just keep in mind, this is 90-year-old newsreel footage, so the sound is what it is. But even if you don't understand every word, you'll get the gist of it.
My sons of Texas, I have come here today to bear the tribute of the nation to you on your 100th birthday, for you are 100 years young. And what a birthday party! A huge $25 million exposition in Dallas with all Texas playing host. 200 acres of magnificent buildings, a new city, a great city, a city of 1,000 sights and 1,000 wonders. No wonder then that the whole nation is talking about this big Texas exposition. The design of the buildings is distinctively Southwestern, a dramatic combination of modern architecture and the simple beauty of the old world. The motive is carried throughout, even to the final touch of stately statues, brilliant fountains, and striking mural decorations.
So what we tried to do in our book, Fair Park Deco, and what we're going to do in the lecture tonight is to try to take you through Fair Park as you might have experienced it if you attended the exposition in 1936. That probably would have started with you coming in through the main gate at Perry Avenue, which would have led you to the Esplanade of State. It was a quarter-mile promenade that was designed to draw you into the heart of the exposition grounds, but also impress you right off the bat with its scale and style. The two biggest exhibit halls on the grounds were on either side. On the left in this picture, the Hall of Transportation, which is now the Centennial Building, and on the right, the Hall of Varied Industries. Both of those exhibit halls were remakes of older state fair buildings, and I just want to take a second to show you the Hall of Transportation on the left. This is how it looked when it was originally built around the turn of the 20th century as a state fair exhibit hall. In the summer of 1935 and the spring of 36, George Dahl and his team expanded and remodeled the building, and it came out looking like this. So even when they reused old architecture, they made sure to make it look fresh and new.
The Esplanade of State featured 6 porticos of state, which represented the 6 nations whose 6 flags flew over Texas. Each one had a unique statue for that specific nation. The sculptors were Lawrence Tenney Stevens and Raul Jose, who had both worked at the Chicago World's Fair. This one is the Republic of Texas, the portico of the Republic of Texas. George Dahl said he could have designed something very fanciful if the Dallas Fair had been like other expositions where all the buildings were going to be demolished right after the fair closed. But because the Dallas Fair was going to be the permanent home of the State Fair of Texas, he had to keep things much simpler. He said he was inspired by Spanish colonial architecture, but the buildings didn't really have a style beyond being contemporary. And you can see that in this photograph. The depth of the buildings is from light and shadow, and there really isn't a lot of ornamentation on any of the buildings.
And what ornamentation there is generally painted on, and that not only allows the designs to remain clean, but again, it allowed everything to be done on time and on budget because they weren't having to bring out sculptors to do trim. The main color on the Esplanade of State comes from 12 large-scale murals. There are 2 big murals under each of the porticos, and they had to do with the buildings that they were on. So on the transportation building, these are 2 of the murals by an Italian muralist, Carlo Campaglia, who became the chief muralist at the exposition. The one on the left is Old Methods of Transportation. It doesn't really show up in this picture, but the woman is holding a scroll with pictures of like covered wagons and Model Ts and things on it. And then on the right is Railroad Transportation. Across the way on the Hall of Varied Industries, the murals related to science and technology. These were done by Pierre Bourdelle, and the one on the left here is lens making, and the one on the right is a scene from a power dam.
Pierre Bourdelle also did what were called cameo murals, which are low-definition friezes over the entrances to the buildings. And these were supposed to reflect the exhibits inside when you entered the buildings. This one is called Streamline. It was over the entrance to the Chrysler Pavilion. And at that point, Chrysler was introducing the Airflow automobile, the first streamlined automobile manufactured in the United States.
In the Chrysler Pavilion, a lot of people who attended the exposition said they thought that was the most beautiful exhibit hall on the grounds. The main space inside was a 2-story room that was completely lined in blue-tinted mirrors. It was called the Chrysler Hall of Mirrors, and the PR staff for the exposition said there were more mirrors in the Chrysler Hall of Mirrors than there were in the Versailles Hall of Mirrors. And the ones in Versailles are not blue, so that's another nod to Dallas. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any pictures from the Chrysler Pavilion. We looked coast to coast. We called around. We checked every place we could think of, and
Chrysler doesn't have any.
yeah, even Chrysler doesn't have any. We do have newsreel footage that was shot in there. So in this next clip, you're going to see the Chrysler Pavilion go by in the background. You'll also see something that was being exhibited in the Chrysler Pavilion along with the cars, the Hammond electric organ, which made its debut here at the fair, and you will see just how exciting it was for fairgoers.
Incidentally, folks, this is one fair where you can spend the whole day on the ground, never have an idle moment, and yet never spend a nickel if you don't want to. Here is one of the 3 attractions in one of the many air-conditioned buildings on the ground. Cool and entertaining, and it doesn't cost a penny. At the organ, Merle Carr.
I mean, they can barely contain themselves.
If that were not entertaining enough, the other big performer at the Chrysler Pavilion is this mechanical man made out of auto parts. And he was wired so that a comedian hidden behind a curtain could eavesdrop on the crowds in front of the mechanical man. And the description is that the comedian would crack wise to the audience. And supposedly he was one of the most popular entertainers on the exposition grounds. You heard him mention that the Chrysler Pavilion was air-conditioned. That had some surprising consequences. You could buy a season pass to the exposition, sort of like you can do at Six Flags, and what they found is people were coming in after work, bridge clubs were coming in the afternoon, and just hanging out in the air conditioning. And so the Chrysler Pavilion started hosting women's clubs. They had a section where you could write letters and postcards and mail them to your family. It sort of became the living room of Dallas for the summer of 1936.
And Chrysler, GM, and Ford all had their own facilities on the fairgrounds. So in the rest of the transportation building, the bulk of the exhibits were put on by railroads because that was the other main method of transportation for people back then. Some of them were really elaborate. One that I wish was still around was the T&P exhibit for the Texas and Pacific. It was a model of their rail line from New Orleans to El Paso. What you really can't tell from this picture, the model railroad goes through models of all the cities that were along the line, but then out in the countryside, there were grazing cattle, guys working on farms, gushing oil wells, and every figure moved. It was all animated. They said that it was built for the enjoyment of children, but the kids would complain because the adults were all standing so close that the kids couldn't see it, which I can identify with. Across the way in the Hall of Varied Industries, the exhibits had to do with invention and science and technology. GE was one of the big exhibitors over there. They had a model home that was filled with electric appliances, but GE's big attraction was a theater called the House of Magic, where they showed off some of their latest innovations. And we have a little bit of footage from the House of Magic. You're going to see another invention that was making its debut at the exposition. You'll recognize it, but not in the form you'll see here.
They're headed for the House of Magic, a great attraction in the Varied Industries building. Here in their own little theater, the House of Magic demonstrates many things. Magic is right. Now watch closely and the man will demonstrate a scientific way to pop popcorn. Radio waves do the job between 2 jars of cold water.
Microwave cooking would have seemed like magic in a state where a lot of homes still didn't have electricity. GE's other big contribution to the exposition was the lighting system and a lighting engineer. The exposition was known for its light show, its nightly light show. Unfortunately, there aren't any color photos from 1936, but it was either really spectacular or really tacky, and maybe both. The buildings changed colors. The statues changed colors. That sort of crown of searchlights at the end of the Esplanade of State, there were 24. They swept the sky. They were different colors, and they could be seen all the way to White Rock Lake. We do have a hand-tinted postcard that'll give you a little bit of an idea, but the sense of motion was one thing that people really talked about. The motion and just so many lights.
At the end of the Esplanade is a building that we're all familiar with, hopefully. The State of Texas building, AKA the Hall of State these days. It was built with a $1.2 million appropriation from Austin. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of the exposition grounds, and during the fair served as kind of a Texas History Museum. The idea was it would stand for years to come as just kind of a general shrine to Texas, which is as good a description of the building as any. It's big, was supposed to impress you with its size and its design. They also were proud of the fact that it was completely built with Texas materials. Even the cement and the structure was made in North Texas cement factories.
It was supposed to be designed by a consortium of Dallas architects. Are there any architects here? Good. Architects being architects, they couldn't come to an agreement. Sorry, one. I insulted one. Excuse me. So the exposition hired a young Houston architect, Donald Barthelme Sr., and he took all the plans, the competing plans, and came up with this building. This is probably where you entered the building tonight, walked under an 11-foot bronze statue covered in gold leaf by Dallas sculptor Allie Tennant. It's called Tejas Warrior. She said it didn't represent any specific tribe, just the native peoples of Texas. One thing we found in the DHS archives was information about the model for Tejas Warrior. His name was Austin Barbosa. He was described as Dallas's first gym owner and fitness model. He was 26 when this was sculpted. He later became a dog walker and a massage therapist. Jim and I have spoken at quite a few women's clubs, and when we mentioned Austin Barbosa, the first time we mentioned it, we were really surprised that people knew him, but they just, oh, Austin. It's kind of weird a little bit.
If you want to get a bunch of Park Cities ladies of a certain age all a Twitter, just mention Austin Barbosa and see what happens. It's something. We have to say that the photos that we're showing you here of the Hall of State were taken before the restoration that happened in the last couple of years. So the building looks good in these photos, but you can see walking outside it looks even better now. Part of what makes this building so special is the combination of the exterior and interior design. David mentioned Donald Barthelme kind of putting all the designs together into the current building. The interiors were done by Adams & Adams of San Antonio, a firm that had a lot of experience working with the state on public projects of kind of this size and scale. And the interior design is just as exceptional as the outside. The space you encounter when you walk through those main doors is called the Hall of the Heroes. It's a semicircular entrance hall that has larger-than-life statues of Texas heroes by Italian sculptor Pompeo Capini. And opening off of this were 4 exhibit halls that were themed to regions of Texas, north, south, east, and west.
This is the East Texas room. Each of the rooms featured materials from that region. So the East Texas room is paneled in East Texas sweet gum. Now, during the exposition, these rooms would have been filled with display cases. They included historic artifacts, historic documents. It's really better to see the rooms like this because you can really appreciate the design, the quality of the materials, and the quality of the craftsmanship that went into this building.
And each of the regional rooms has at least one large-scale piece of art, usually a mural. In the case of the North Texas room, it's a fresco, a true fresco that was painted on wet plaster by a Dallas artist named Arthur Starr Niendorf. He took a lot of time to think of everything that meant North Texas to him and put it all in this fresco, which he was still working on the morning that the building opened, so he didn't let deadlines stand in his way. There is a refinery, there's a bank vault, there's wheat, there's corn, there's a storm, there's a farm, there's a train, there's a plane. The guy in the middle is Old Man Texas, who was a popular cartoon character in the Dallas Morning News at the time. He is holding the skylines of Dallas and Fort Worth, which he's going to use to crush that family any minute. Little do they know. It's really something, though, when you look at everything he's managed to fit in here. And there's also so much detail in the artwork in this building. A good case in point is that book that you see down in the bottom right corner. When you get in close, you realize Niendorf has painted his acknowledgments into the book. So he thanks his parents and his art teachers and the architects of the building. He's put a couple of his art textbooks over here. And then in the back right is a rolled up copy of the Dallas Morning News from the day that Old Man Texas was introduced. And if you look up that paper, that's exactly what it looks like. So he really went all in on the details here. Now, those regional rooms are not the biggest space in the building. The kind of principal interior space is the Hall of State itself. The building we mentioned was initially called the State of Texas Building, but it was quickly nicknamed the Hall of State after this room. Meant to be a big ceremonial hall, which is what it is today. Newspapers, when this building opened, called it the Westminster Abbey of the New World, and it's easy to roll your eyes at that until you walk into this room, and then you understand what they meant.
The focal point of the room is called the Great Medallion. It was designed by Adams & Adams, the interior architects, and they found it very challenging because they were trying to get 6 nations around a 5-pointed star. And they said when they finally figured it out, it just seemed like it should have been so obvious. But it's 25 feet across and covered in 3 tones of gold leaf.
And it's big, but it's not the biggest piece of art in that room. That honor goes to the murals on the side walls, each of which is 30 feet high and 90 feet long. These were said to have been the largest oil murals in the world when they were installed. They were done by an artist named Eugene Savage from Yale University, and the theme of the murals is the history and culture of Texas.
And of course it features the Alamo, because Savage would have been strung up if he didn't include it. He was really concerned with authenticity. And so he collected images of Texas heroes so that the people he painted would, to the best of his ability, look like the historic figures. Apparently, the only pictures he could find of Davy Crockett were when he was serving in Congress. So Davy Crockett is heading off to fight at the Alamo in a little cravat and probably a cutaway coat.
Now, who's to say he didn't? Yeah. Maybe he's just a really well-dressed.
John Wayne, if you look at that poster up in the room
true.
up there.
Yeah, well, one of them is wrong. Next door to the State of Texas building was the Federal Building, built with $875,000 from Washington. It housed the offices of federal officials at the exposition and also the exhibits of the federal government. The tower that you see here was the tallest structure on the fairgrounds in 1936, 175 feet tall, topped by a gilded federal eagle, and then that's gold leaf fluting that runs down the entire height of the tower.
And there's a large work of art at the base of the building, 175 feet long, contains more than 100 figures, slightly bigger than life size, by Julian Garnsey, a Los Angeles artist. Some of them are figures from history. Up on the left, with his head sticking under the shadow, is LaSalle. On the right, Jean Lafitte. And down at the bottom is the Battle of San Jacinto. And that broken wood down in the right corner is supposed to be Vince's Bridge, which was demolished so that the Mexican army couldn't retreat.
The Federal Building had one of the best interior spaces on the fairgrounds. It was called the reception room, and what it essentially was like a VIP lounge where they could entertain visiting dignitaries like FDR when he came to make his speech. Maybe not a room that we would have been able to go in, but it had a pretty spectacular modern design, even down to the furniture. The room contained a custom conference set that was produced by Herman Miller. What is great about this room is it's still there, and it still looks a lot like it did in 1936, thanks to some restoration work. That Herman Miller furniture is still there, and a lot of the original features. You probably know this already, but this building is open during working hours, so if you come out here during the week, you can walk in and take a look, which is well worth the time.
The entrance to the federal exhibits was through this rotunda, very colorful, designed by Julian Garnsey. Again, 48 stars on the ceiling, 13 stars on the floor, and floor-to-ceiling murals for east, west, north, south of the United States. The space still exists, but it has been painted over the years. There has been some exploratory work, and you can see in the ceiling one of the stars still peeking out there and some other detailing. And down at the bottom, there's some details from the murals. So it has the potential.
The Federal Building and the State of Texas Building both stood on one of the main cross-axes of the exposition grounds called the Federal Concourse. And the Federal Concourse was anchored by the biggest private exhibit building at the fair, the Ford Motor Company building, designed by prominent Detroit architect Albert Kahn, with interiors by Walter Dorwin Teague, who was the leading industrial designer in the country at the time.
The theme of the Ford Pavilion, I made up a word, was from the soil to finished automobiles, and it featured Texas agricultural products that went into the manufacture of Ford cars. So one of the things when you walked into the building was the Fountain of Texas Products, which showcased mohair and cotton, which went into fabrics, cattle, which were for leather, and for beef tallow, which was used for lubrication, which was a little bit surprising. The room had a low ceiling and was a little bit dark, and then when the doors opened, you stepped into a 300-foot-long, brightly lit, high-ceilinged, air-conditioned sort of showroom, but each of the stations featured a demonstration of a different Texas product that went into a car. They did not build an automobile in the pavilion, but they demonstrated all the steps in construction.
And when you got to the end of this, you found yourself in a showroom where you could check out the latest Fords and Lincolns and Zephyrs. You could arrange to be test driven on a road that they had built around the lagoon here at Fair Park that simulated famous roads and street surfaces of the Southwest. That doesn't sound exciting, I don't know what does. And you could arrange, this is the thing that really gets me, you could arrange with your hometown Ford or Lincoln dealer to trade in your car by telegraph. And it was Chrysler who also did that?
Chrysler did it too.
Yeah,
and
so
the new car would be waiting for you when you got home from the fair.
Yeah, somehow that worked.
Mm-hmm. The executive lounge in the Ford building was a space that Teague said he wanted to be physically cool because it was air conditioned and psychologically cool, so he used light green, light blue. This is where Ford executives, Ford dealers could gather and discuss business. It's also where VIPs who came to the Ford Pavilion visited. The reason we showed this to you is to demonstrate the quality of the design that went into a building that was meant to be demolished. The Ford building was one of the temporary buildings on the fairgrounds, and it was demolished in 2 years.
So also on the Federal Concourse was the building that the Gulf Oil Company sponsored. It was the entertainment center for the fairgrounds, the Gulf Radio Studios. The building contained up-to-date radio studios where original programming could be produced that could be piped to different areas of the of Fair Park. They could also tap into the national radio networks when something big happened, like when FDR came and spoke. And the man who was in charge of the programming at Fair Park was an up-and-coming radio guy, Art Linkletter. That'll be a name that resonates with some of you, maybe not all of you, but the rest of you have Google.
Kids say the darndest things.
They do.
See?
You got a big laugh right out there.
Yeah. And that's what happens when I go off script. The radio system also included a series of large outdoor amplifiers. They were called singing towers, and they were spread throughout the fairgrounds. The fairgrounds were divided into 6 separate areas. Each area had its own music and got its own special announcements, except at midnight when the fairgrounds were closing, all of the singing towers played Tumblin' Tumbleweeds by the Sons of the Pioneers, who were also appearing at the exposition. And this was right before the Sons of the Pioneers went to Hollywood, and their lead singer, Leonard Sly, became famous as Roy Rogers. Another name.
Around on the north side of the fairgrounds, the buildings were dedicated to agriculture and livestock, and these were largely, arenas and livestock exhibit buildings, but they were also designed in the same modernistic style as the rest of Fair Park. And this is where you really do see what the Centennial Exposition was. It had this focus on agriculture and livestock because it was really, they called it a World's Fair, but it was really a big, super fancy state fair. And the exposition's PR department was proud of this. They said other World's Fairs have focused on science and technology and human achievement. The Texas Centennial Exposition is the first one to focus on animals and livestock.
Agriculture.
Agriculture and livestock.
Yeah. There were no foreign pavilions at the exposition. It wasn't a World's Fair. In fact, they only invited 2 countries, Great Britain and Mexico. The British ignored the invitation, and the Mexican government got extremely insulted because they were being asked to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Texas independence from Mexico. And the Roosevelt administration had to step in to kind of cool things down. Even though these were the agricultural buildings, they still had the classical murals, like along the Esplanade of State. This is called Wheat Harvesters, also by Carlo Campagna. When the bids were going out for the exposition, there was a group of local artists called the Dallas Nine, and they expected to get a lot of work from the fair. And they did, but they were hired as assistants to the artists who had experience at the Chicago Fair. That didn't stop them from submitting their own ideas. Probably the best known was Jerry Bywaters, and this is what he wanted to paint where wheat harvesters went in. Very different, but it looks very much like the murals that Bywaters would paint in post offices around the state under the Works Progress Administration.
The agricultural area was filled with art. One of my favorite series of pieces is these animal heads that are over the entrances to one of the livestock exhibit buildings, painted by Pierre Bourdelle. They're these super stylized Art Deco animals like a ram, a pig, and a cow. And the pig is the hard one to make out. I've gotten used to it, but its nose is down and to the right. If you can't see it at first, maybe that helps. These are very unusual looking animals, but not the most unusual animal in their neighborhood.
The woofus. Head of a sheep, neck of a horse, body of a pig, wings of a duck, tail of a turkey, and a set of chromium longhorns by Lawrence Tenney Stevens. And it's not just a statue, it's a very sad little fountain with that pipe coming out of the sheep's mouth. The crowds loved it. Not everyone associated with the fair loved it. One of the architects said it was an abomination and that it never should have been built, and that Stevens was an ass. Around 1940, they were doing repairs on the livestock building and knocked the nose off the woofus. And they took it down and said it was going to be repaired, and it was never seen again. This is a reproduction that was created under the auspices of Friends of Fair Park, using the original models, and was put in place about 20 years ago.
And it is, more popular than ever, I guess. After our book came out, and that included the woofus, we got contacted by the Lawrence Tenney Stevens archivist in Arizona, and he said, I see you put the woofus in your book, you must know the backstory of the woofus. And we said, well, no. And so he sent it to us, and it turns out Stevens kind of had a weird sense of humor. He typed up the woofus's life story and never, as far as I can tell, did anything with it, but it exists, and now I get to tell you. The woofus's mom was an Australian sheep who vacationed in the United States, and as she traveled around, she made really close friends with a lot of animals that she met, and eventually she became pregnant, and then when her kid was born, this was it. And they said, who's the father? And she said, everybody. And that was essentially the story of how the woofus came to be. Maybe a little PG-13 for 1936, I don't know. But anyway, if you ever wondered, how does an animal get to look like this? It starts with a adventurous Australian sheep.
I had another word in mind, but go on.
Well, it's a family program. The woofus stands in front of the swine building, which was another one of the livestock exhibit buildings at the fair. This one is interesting because, as far as we can tell, it is really unchanged from 1936. The fixtures that you see, the fencing, and the paint is all, as far as we know, original. So the paint scheme here has faded, but this is one of the only places I know of on the fairgrounds where you can go and actually see that original paint job.
And even though it's an agricultural building, it has sort of an industrial feel, especially those clear story windows up on the roof line. The exposition advertised that it was the first air-conditioned World's Fair, and that was kind of true. The exhibit buildings were air conditioned. The agriculture buildings had air exchange systems, which pulled cool air in through the doors and forced hotter air out through those windows up there. They say it made the buildings 10 degrees cooler than the outside temperature. Dallas was experiencing terrible heat waves during 1936, so it was about 110 degrees a lot of days when the fair was happening. So 100 degrees is better than 110, but you're in with hundreds of goats and sheep and swine. So, air conditioned.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
A couple of buildings over from the swine building is what was originally the Hall of Foods, and we wanted to show you this lobby because the paint scheme has been restored here, so you can get a sense of how rich the colors were, and you see a lot of these kind of same shades used on the restored paint in the Hall of State too. So all the buildings on the fairgrounds would have sort of tied in with each other color-wise, but you can imagine how much different the swine building would have looked when all the colors were in full force. Another thing to point out here, again, the decoration that you see is largely painted on because of time and budget. The Hall of Foods has something else interesting in it too.
Yes, the last surviving exhibit booth from 1936 was built by the Gebhardt Chili Powder Company. Still in use, not by Gebhardt. It was supposed to be a Mexican kitchen, and it illustrates some of Dahl's design principles. He did not want any light bulbs visible anywhere on Fair Park. So all of the lighting was recessed. They used a lot of tube lighting, and the signage was backlit. It's called shelf signage. It sits on a shelf, and you see the outline of the letters.
So we talked about the Esplanade of State to the left in this photo. We talked about the agricultural area, which is up at the top. We'll get around to what was on the south side of the fairgrounds at the bottom in a minute, but wanted to pause for a second at the Cotton Bowl, which then as now is right in the middle of things. The Cotton Bowl had been built in 1930, so it was still relatively new, and they didn't have to do a lot with it since it was only 6 years old. What they focused on was the plaza that you used to approach the Cotton Bowl, and the exposition built refreshment stands and restrooms, or as they called them, comfort stations.
And they were very proud of their comfort stations. They made a big deal that they were all free, except you had to pay 2 cents for paper towels and 10 cents for linen towels, and each one had a uniformed attendant.
So off the Cotton Bowl Plaza in one direction was the Midway, which was the profit center of the exposition. Overall, the Centennial Exposition did not make money, and that was kind of the rule of thumb for these big fairs. They didn't really make money, but the Midway did, because every concession on the Midway had its own entry fee on top of the price you paid to get onto the fairgrounds in the first place. So there was a lot happening around here, and there were a lot of options to choose from. There was a Ripley's Believe It or Not, there were carnival rides, there were roller coasters, all sorts of entertainment. We do have a little bit of footage from the Midway here, and just remember, this is 1936.
The Midway. Let's go! The Midway. We're on the Midway. Pretty girls, funny shows, thrilling rides. Watch. Here goes the rocket ship at a terrific rate. Swinging almost upside down. Zoom! Watch that curve. And here's another place to watch the curve. A whole shipload of entertainment at the streets of Paris. Plenty of curves, all right, yes. Here are a dozen shows in one show, with cafes and all kinds of entertainment also on board. What's this, another pinch? Oh, we're in Midget City now. And we've got to do as the little people say. You know, there are more than 100 midgets all living here in Midget City. Just look at them. Now let's find something more diverting. This looks like the spot for the streets of our nation. Did someone make a remark about the Dallas Exposition being all education and no entertainment? Oh, well, not from the looks of this.
These are the dancing debutantes, by the way.
Yeah, they advertised that each one was a real Dallas debutante. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
Yeah.
the announcer said, did somebody say that the Dallas Fair was all about education and not entertainment? Someone did say that. It was Fort Worth, which was having its own Centennial Exposition at the same time Dallas was. Fort Worth hired the Broadway producer Billy Rose to do publicity for their exposition, and Rose papered North Texas with billboards and signs reminding you that you could have more fun in Fort Worth than you could have in Dallas. The biggest one of these was a 3-story neon sign directly across from the main entrance to Fair Park that flashed a constant reminder that there was Wild and Whoopie 45 minutes west.
Not that there wasn't whoopee in Dallas. One thing that surprised us was the amount of liquor on the fairgrounds. And it was really surprising because you couldn't sell liquor by the drink in Texas at that point. The entrance to the streets of Paris, one of the big entertainment areas, was supposed to be the prow of the ocean liner Normandy, which had had its maiden voyage in 1935. The first floor of the Normandy was a liquor store. The upper floors were a private club called the Centennial Club. It was air-conditioned, had its own club rooms, dance floor, and the poop deck overlooked the entertainment areas of the streets of Paris.
We were surprised at how much liquor there was, and we were also surprised at how much nudity there was on the Midway. The fair was really proud of what it called its leg shows. One of the most popular was at the streets of Paris. It was Mona Leslie, the diving Venus, who did a high dive into a pool wearing her working uniform, which was?
A pint of olive oil.
Yes. And she had colored lights on her just in case you didn't get the full effect, then, you know, she would glisten. Down the way a little bit was the Hollywood Nights Review, which starred the demure Della Carroll, a pretty well-known burlesque dancer. She made her entrance to Dallas by parachuting nude into Love Field, although she wasn't really nude.
She was wearing high heels.
Yeah.
She showed up at the Dallas Morning News the next day for an interview, and they described her as heavily bruised. Mona Leslie, Della Carroll were not the biggest stars at the exposition. The breakout star was Mademoiselle Corrine and her apple dance. And we have footage of Mademoiselle Corrine.
Oh, the parasol dance. And maybe if we stick around, we can catch a glimpse of Mademoiselle Corrine, the apple dancer. Now watch closely, the apple dancer. Applesauce. Sorry, folks, you see the film's inflammable.
Mademoiselle Corrine was supposedly a French ballerina who had trained with Russian dance masters in Paris. She was Corinne Bowes from Kaufman, Texas. And when that came out, she just got more popular. The fair's PR department claimed 24,000 people in the Rio Grande Valley had signed a petition asking Mademoiselle Corrine to please change her act from the apple dance to the grapefruit dance because apples aren't grown in Texas. And Mademoiselle Corrine was very gracious, but she said she couldn't because she had already turned down a similar request from the watermelon farmers. So,
Would have been a very different dance.
very, very much.
Not too far from the Midway, the city of Dallas built a group of civic and cultural buildings called the Civic Center, which included the original home of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. The museum was organized around the same time that the exposition was put on. This is what the museum building looks like on the outside.
And this is what it looked like in 1936, and it was about this crowded. The museum had two problems. Its air conditioner hadn't showed up, and it charged a separate admission fee. The museum director was desperate to get people in. So he looked around the fairgrounds, saw what was selling, and one of the most popular attractions was the streets of Paris Olympia, which was based on Manet's painting Olympia, but with real naked ladies. The barker who brought the crowds into Olympia was named Paris Peggy. And we have some footage of Paris Peggy along with subtitles because that's the only way you're going to understand her.
How many people please be kind enough to step right down to the platform? Step right up. I'm not going to bite you. If I bite you, you can bite me there. Now this show is so artistic that it is not being run for pecuniary gain. Now we appear to your intelligence, ladies and gentlemen, your artistic sense and your certified sense.
The museum director's idea was he would evaluate the streets of Paris Olympia for authenticity, and Paris Peggy would come over to the museum and do her spiel in front of 2 nude paintings and 1 nude statue. And it worked. The first time Paris Peggy showed up, 165 people paid to see her talk about 2 paintings and a statue.
It was those eyebrows that really
Yeah.
get you. It always gets me that Paris Peggy has the best line in our presentation, but anyway. There were other buildings in the Civic Center as well, including an aquarium, a natural history museum, and a band shell. All of the buildings still exist. Some are still in use. Not too far away was another one of the private buildings on the fairgrounds, the Magnolia Lounge, built by the Magnolia Petroleum Company. Not really to directly sell you anything, although they wouldn't mind if they sold you Magnolia, but the idea was it was supposed to be a comfortable place for you to hang out. So the building had on its first floor an air-conditioned lounge that was furnished by Neiman Marcus where you could just sit and relax. There was covered seating upstairs on that terrace where you could watch people watch at the exposition. The building was designed by a Swiss-American architect, William Lescaz, who was one of the leading European modernists in the country at the time. And this is said to have been the first European modern building in Texas. It was apparently so modern that it made the fair organizers a little bit nervous, and they wrote to Lescaz and said, "We're not sure that people down here are going to understand this design. Maybe it's a little too modern." Lescaz wrote back and said, "It's not too modern, it's just a good building."
The exposition featured 4 Centennial model homes that were supposed to show how Texans would live in the future. The contemporary house was designed by DeWitt and Washburn, local firm, and furnished by Neiman Marcus. It really was the house of the future. It had central air conditioning and bathrooms on both floors. The contemporary house was used as the Girl Scout Little House until 1949 when it was demolished. Now there's a story that the contemporary house was moved to Gaston Avenue. And if you see this house, you can see why there might be some confusion. But this one was designed by Reynolds Fisher, a different architect, and was actually under construction during the exposition.
One other building in this area that got a lot of attention was the National Cash Register Pavilion. It had the building was designed by Walter Darwin Teague, the same guy who did the interiors of the Ford Pavilion. It was topped by a giant version of National Cash Register's flagship cash register, which Walter Darwin Teague had also designed. Down on the first floor, there was a showroom where NCR showed off its cash registers and adding machines and business equipment. But the big deal about this building was the numbers on the cash register were supposed to be wired to the turnstiles around Fair Park, so they would keep a running total of how many people had come into the park on any given day. Now, Teague designed a similar National Cash Register Pavilion for the New York World's Fair in 1939, and a lot of people claim that it was the first of its kind, but this one existed 3 years earlier.
Probably the most significant building constructed for the Texas Centennial Exposition was the Hall of Negro Life. It was the first exhibit building at any U.S. fair that showcased African American culture and contributions to U.S. education, business. And the Exposition Commission did not want this building. What they really wanted was $3 million from the federal government. And they got it, but within the appropriation was the stipulation that the exposition had to spend $50,000 to construct the Hall of Negro Life and spend an additional $50,000 on exhibits, and staffing.
And the exhibits in here were not nearly as elaborate as the ones you'd see from the big exhibitors over on the Esplanade of State. They mostly came from black fraternal organizations, colleges, small businesses. But again, the fact that this building existed in the South in 1936 is what makes it so important.
The most talked about feature in the Hall of Negro Life was a series of 4 murals by Aaron Douglas, one of the leading artists of the Harlem Renaissance. 2 of them survive. The one on the left is Into Bondage. It's at the National Gallery in Washington. The one on the right is Aspiration, and it is at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. Very different from the classically inspired murals you saw in the other buildings, and that's one of the reasons they were talked about so much.
Now we're going to wrap up by talking about what happened to Fair Park after the Centennial Exposition closed, and the fact is, this gets lost in the shuffle a lot, but it did come back for a second season in a way. It was the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936, and then in 1937, it was the Greater Texas and Pan American Exposition. They said that the title was longer than the exposition itself. It did not get the same attendance, it didn't have the same exhibitors that it did in 1936, so it was kind of a shadow of the Centennial Exposition. Then after that, about 40% of the buildings were demolished as planned, and the other 60% were turned over to the State Fair. So the State Fair went back to running its show here. They're great at running a state fair, but in those days they were not too concerned about preserving the 1936 art and architecture. So when paint would start to flake off the buildings and the murals would start to peel, they would just come in and paint over everything. What you see here is the outside of the Chrysler Pavilion in the 1960s after it had probably been painted a couple of times. Everything is hidden under a kind of uniform coat of neutral, including you can see the outlines of some of the reliefs on the outside of the building there.
Yeah, that's streamlined there. That one little arc. Yeah. These buildings did not survive because everybody just loved Art Deco architecture. About every 5 years there'd be a plan to demolish everything and rebuild, and then there wouldn't be money, and so they'd put another coat of paint on the buildings. This is the Hall of Agriculture you saw earlier. In the 1970s, it was orange and brown, because it was the 1970s.
Around this time, by the late 70s, early 80s, the sesquicentennial of Texas, the 150th anniversary of independence was approaching, and there was kind of a renewed interest in Texas history in general, but in Fair Park specifically. And people started to wonder about the murals from 1936. Most of them had not been seen since the war, because that was about the time that they were painted over. So some exploratory work was done on the Esplanade murals, and it was discovered that there were paint fragments remaining. This is one of the Carlo Campaglia murals, or what was left of it when they uncovered it. Using these paint fragments along with historic photos and drawings, the murals were able to be recreated. So that became this, which is airplane transportation on the former Hall of Transportation.
Dallas voters approved a major bond issue that allowed the recreation of statuary at Fair Park. This is tenor and contralto on the Esplanade. The backdrop is a replica of a singing tower. At about this time in 1986, the National Park Service designated Fair Park a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest level of significance for landmarks in the country. So people really recognized its significance.
There is still work to be done. We showed you the rotunda in the Federal Building earlier that's painted over. This is another view of the Foods Building lobby, and that curved wall has a mural on it. You can see there's been a little bit of exploratory work done there, but the exciting thing about this one is nobody knows what the mural is. So one day it will be uncovered, and not only will it be a restoration, it's going to be a discovery. So there's still some exciting finds out here.
And there's a lot of exciting work going on. Of course, Fair Park is still a Dallas City park. There's interpretive signage around the grounds. It tells you about the buildings, tells you about the artwork. It's really better to see Fair Park when the fair is not happening, because you can actually see the buildings. You can also visit the Hall of State without paying to park a mile away. And we've brought people here from all over to see Fair Park.
Yeah, and they get excited about it because they realize what it is. It's not only a special place for Texans, it's a special place for everybody. It's one of the biggest collections of related Art Deco, art and architecture anywhere in the world. It is one of the only places you can go to get a sense of what it was like to attend one of these 1930s fairs, because the big fairgrounds in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, they were demolished when the fair closed, and we still have 60%, give or take, of what was here in 1936. So it's always nice to close with how lucky we are to have this, especially y'all in your own backyard. We have to stop at Buc-ee's on the way, but it's still worth the trip to come up here and see it. I just want to mention that Fair Park Deco, our book was funded in part by a grant from the Summerlee Foundation. We do have books available out in the foyer. If anybody would like to take one home, we would be happy to set you up with that. But in the meantime, we're happy to take questions if anybody has any, and thank you so much for your attention.